There was so much grief in our hearts. I think as parents, we felt, oh, we're failures. You know, here we've tried to raise our kids to do.
The Duggars think they know exactly how to survive a courtroom. They have been in this exact position before, standing shoulder to shoulder, projecting a quiet, unified family front to the world. They actually believe that their high-priced lawyers, their endless real estate bail money, and their rehearsed silence will save Joseph the same way they desperately tried to save his older brother just a few years ago. But they are walking blindly into a devastating trap. Because here, in 2026, the prosecution isn't just putting Joseph Duggar on trial. They are actively weaponizing the Duggar family's own rigid rulebook against them. By the time Jim Bob realizes the walls are closing in, it is going to be entirely too late. This is a fatal legal and psychological snare. The very theology, strict accountability structures, and calculated public relations strategies the Duggars used to build their multi-million-dollar empire are about to become the exact weapons the state uses to secure a conviction. Before we dive deeper into the insider reports and exclusive, the theories surrounding this massive legal collapse, do me a huge favor. If you want the real story behind the headlines, hit that like button and subscribe to Daniel Research right now. We are exposing the timeline piece by piece, so make sure your notifications are turned on because you absolutely do not want to miss what we uncover next. When a family survives a massive public scandal, they start to believe they are bulletproof. They start to believe their defensive playbook is flawless. For the Duggars, that playbook has always been incredibly simple. They close ranks, they say absolutely nothing to the press, they hire the most expensive defense attorneys money can buy, and they wait for the secular world to get distracted and move on. It worked for them in the early 2000s, and it kept their television empire afloat for over a decade. But here is the bitter irony of Joseph's current legal situation unfolding in Florida. That exact survival tactic, the unified closed rank silence, is the very strategy the prosecution has been waiting for. The state is not afraid of the Duggar family's silence. In fact, they are banking on it. Because in a modern courtroom, a multi-year pattern of coordinated silence no longer looks like a conservative Christian family in mourning. It looks exactly like a premeditated cover-up. Exclusive theories claim that investigators have been documenting every time a family member refused to speak, building a timeline that points directly to a tightly controlled inner circle. But that is only the beginning of their nightmare. This brings us to the most fatal contradiction in their entire defense strategy, a contradiction that insider reports suggest has their legal team completely panicking behind closed doors. For 20 years, Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar sold a highly specific product to the American public. That product was total parental oversight. They wrote best-selling books boasting about their strict internet filters, their constant chaperoning, and their hyper-vigilant accountability structures. They built a brand on the promise that they knew exactly what their children were doing at every single moment of the day. But now, sitting in a defense chair, Joseph's lawyers are being forced to argue the exact opposite. To create reasonable doubt for Joseph, the defense has to claim that things slipped through the cracks. They have to argue that the family simply did not know what was happening and that Joseph was operating entirely in the dark, hidden from Jim Bob's watchful eye. You can already see the trap closing around them. The Duggars must choose their poison. Either their massive television brand was a complete and utter fraud and they were incredibly neglectful parents, or their brand was entirely real, which means they knew exactly what was happening under their roof and actively chose to hide it. Legally and logically, they cannot have it both ways. Rumours suggest that the prosecution is literally planning to read excerpts from the Duggars' own parenting books to the jury, using Jim Bob's own published words to trap the defence. And because of that massive contradiction, Jim Bob Duggar is currently staring down the barrel of an impossible credibility dilemma. Reports claim the patriarch is pacing the floors of the Tontitown compound, trying to figure out if he should take the stand. If Jim Bob testifies as a character witness to protect his son, the prosecution gets the ultimate prize. They get to cross-examine him. The absolute second Jim Bob is under oath, the door swings wide open for the state to ask about the family's entire history. They can bring up the police reports from the early 2000s. They can dig into the complicated financial structures allegedly used to keep certain family members quiet over the years. But if Jim Bob refuses to testify, if he invokes his Fifth Amendment rights or simply decides to stay out of the state of Florida entirely, the optics are catastrophic. He would effectively be abandoning his most compliant son to the wolves, instantly shattering the core illusion of the fiercely protective patriarch that he spent decades cultivating. It is a brilliant legal double bind designed by the state, and there is absolutely no way out without taking massive permanent damage to his reputation and his freedom. While this psychological chess match is playing out in the legal filings, the financial clock is violently ticking down in the background. Everyone has been talking about that massive $600,000 bond, and there is endless chatter about Travis Story and the expensive Florida defense attorneys stepping in to handle the case. But what nobody is talking about is the devastating paper trail this defense is actively creating to fund a multi-jurisdictional $1 million defense strategy in 2026. Without any network television income flowing in, Jim Bob has to move major assets. Insider theories suggest that the family trust is burning through cash at an unprecedented rate. Jim Bob has to leverage, refinance, or quietly liquidate pieces of his Northwest Arkansas real estate empire just to keep the lawyers working. But property records are entirely public. Every single time the Duggars quietly sell a parcel of land in Tontitown or transfer a commercial property to pay a massive legal retainer, they are financially bleeding out in front of the entire world. Rumours suggest that local real estate developers have noticed a sudden, desperate offloading of Duggar-owned properties at below market prices. The stakes are no longer just about preserving a cancelled television show or maintaining a public image. They are quite literally about preventing the total financial bankruptcy of the Duggar family trust. The prosecution knows that a drawn-out legal battle will drain the family's resources, leaving them with nothing left to fight with. But the money running dry is not going to be the knockout blow in this courtroom. The real devastation is going to come from something much closer to home. And it involves a secret timeline that the family thought they had successfully buried years ago. Remember the massive digital disappearance that everyone noticed back in a few years ago? Joseph and Kendra completely vanished from the internet. At the time, the family's massive public relations machine, along with the few loyal apologists they still had left in their corner, desperately tried to paint a very specific sympathetic picture for the public. They wanted the world to believe this was simply a young, modest couple grieving the sudden cancellation of their television show and buckling under the intense emotional stress of the older brother's legal nightmare. They spun the disappearance as a quiet, spiritual retreat into faith and privacy. But insider reports are currently painting a drastically different and much darker picture of what was actually happening behind closed doors. Prosecutors are reportedly building a concrete day-by-day timeline that links this exact digital blackout to something far more sinister. They are going to frame that multi-year stretch of absolute silence, not as innocent family grieving, but as the exact moment a deep internal panic set in across the compound. Rumours suggest that federal investigators have subpoenaed communication records showing a sudden, calculated scrubbing of their entire digital footprint right as authorities were closing in on the broader family circle. Exclusive theories circulating among legal analysts claim that this specific timeline is going to be the absolute knockout blow in the courtroom. The prosecution is prepared to argue that this was a legally advised, highly orchestrated vanishing act. It was pure consciousness of guilt. Think about how this looks from the perspective of a jury sitting in a jury box. When they are shown the chronological charts, when they see the exact dates proving that Joseph went completely dark and isolated his family the very second the feds started cracking down and looking into the family's shared servers, that multi-year silence is going to scream louder than a written confession. Reports claim there are even whispers of hidden digital devices, wiped hard drives, and encrypted communications that were allegedly disposed of during this exact window of time. While we have to stress that these are just rumours circulating in legal circles right now, the mere introduction of this timeline in a courtroom is designed to completely shatter the illusion of their simple, off-the-grid lifestyle. The defence is going to have to find a way to explain away half a decade of suspicious, perfectly timed isolation, and claiming they just wanted a little privacy from the media is absolutely not going to hold up under the brutal, relentless scrutiny of a cross-examination. To truly understand why this specific case is so uniquely devastating to the Duggar legacy and why Joseph is so legally vulnerable right now, you have to look past the surface and dissect who he really was in the family dynamic. Everyone remembers the older brother as the arrogant, untouchable golden boy who thought he was much smarter than everyone else in the room. But Joseph was entirely different. Joseph was famously branded to the public as the compliant son. He was the ultimate rule follower, the quiet, obedient soldier of Jim Bob's strict theology. For years, viewers watched him seamlessly blend into the background, doing exactly what he was told, courting exactly who he was told to court, and faithfully attending the strict training centres of their fundamentalist sect without ever raising a single question. But that exact behavioural trait, his flawless obedience to the system, is going to be surgically dissected in court. Reports suggest the prosecution is bringing in psychological experts on authoritarian family structures to testify about how this level of extreme compliance actually works in practice. They are prepared to argue that Joseph's deep, unwavering adherence to the family's rigid patriarchal hierarchy wasn't about personal righteousness or pure faith. It was about learning exactly how to operate perfectly within a closed, highly monitored system designed to silence dissent and protect its own members from outside scrutiny. He knew the family rule book better than anyone else. He understood exactly how the accountability machine worked, and exclusive theories claim he used that exact inside knowledge to hide his actions in plain sight. Because he was the undisputed good boy of the family, nobody ever questioned him, nobody looked twice at his activities or checked his browsing history. Rumours suggest that former insiders, people who used to be deeply embedded in the family's church, are actually willing to take the stand to explain how being the compliant son provided the ultimate impenetrable cover. The state will paint a terrifying picture of a man who used his lifelong reputation for absolute obedience as a shield, manipulating the very strict accountability rules his parents bragged about on television to ensure nobody ever monitored his whereabouts. It is a brilliant psychological profile by the prosecution, effectively turning his best public attribute into his biggest, most inescapable legal liability. When these chilling behavioural profiles and the incredibly suspicious digital timelines start piling up in front of the judge, the defence will inevitably panic and pivot to the absolute last move the Duggars have left in their fading playbook. They will fall back on the emotional appeal. They are going to try to play the persecuted, naive, homeschooling Christian family being unfairly targeted and harassed by a hostile secular government. We all saw them try this exact same routine a few years ago. We saw the softly spoken answers, the downcast eyes, the modest clothing, and the unified front of tearful relatives sitting directly behind the defence table. It was entirely designed to pull at the heartstrings of the jury and create reasonable doubt based purely on their wholesome religious identity. But there is a massive, unforgiving reality check waiting for them this time around. This is not a friendly, familiar church basement in rural Arkansas where everyone knows their name. This is a high-stakes felony courtroom in the state of Florida, heavily monitored by national media. Insider reports claim that expensive jury consultants are already frantically warning the defense team that this emotional strategy is completely doomed to fail. A jury in 2026 sitting through an exhausting trial for a second son, facing horrific accusations surfacing from the shadows, is absolutely not going to buy the tearful modesty routine. The rehearsed emotional appeals that worked so perfectly for years in front of forgiving reality television cameras are going to look chillingly inauthentic, deeply manipulative, and entirely staged under the harsh fluorescent lights of a secular courthouse. Rumours suggest the Prosecution has actually spent months studying the family's past media appearances, preparing to point out the calculated nature of their public emotional displays to the jury. When the defense tries to paint Joseph as a simple, misunderstood family man who just got caught up in a misunderstanding, the state will be waiting to dismantle that facade. They are going to show the jury that the tears only start falling when the legal consequences finally arrive. The exact emotional manipulation that sustained their television ratings for a decade will suddenly become glaring evidence of their deceptive nature, turning the jury against them in a matter of minutes. And this brings us to the pivotal moment where the trial will transition from a simple legal proceeding into a full-scale ideological autopsy of the entire Duggar empire. We have to look at the massive thematic hypocrisy sitting at the very centre of this case. The fundamental core morale of the family's television brand, the beating heart of their entire multi-million-dollar existence, was a massive, unbreakable promise made to the American public. They promised that their extreme, isolated lifestyle was the one and only way to protect children from the dark, corrupting evils of the outside world. They told millions of viewers that if you dressed a certain way, if you courted instead of dated, if you threw out your television sets and completely isolated your children from secular society, your family would be entirely safe from harm. That was the product they sold in their books. That was the theology they exported to thousands of loyal followers at massive conferences. But exclusive theories suggest the Florida prosecution is preparing to absolutely obliterate this core premise in front of the world. They are not just putting a man on trial, they are putting the entire lifestyle on trial. Reports claim that prosecutors will methodically, ruthlessly prove that the massive structural walls the Duggars built around their Arkansas, the compound didn't actually keep the predators out. Instead, those heavily guarded walls just locked the victims safely inside. They created a perfectly insulated environment where bad actors could operate with total, terrifying impunity, completely shielded by a culture that demanded total obedience and severely punished anyone who dared to speak out or ask questions. Rumours are swirling that former members of their inner circle, people who once deeply believed in this protective bubble, have been quietly cooperating with authorities for months. They are reportedly ready to expose exactly how the strict modesty rules and the extreme isolation were actually weaponized against the vulnerable. The state is going to frame the Duggar compound not as a wholesome spiritual sanctuary, but as a heavily guarded fortress designed specifically to keep the truth from ever getting out. This level of thematic hypocrisy is what will truly resonate with the jury, destroying the good family narrative entirely and leaving nothing behind but the exposed mechanics of a calculated system of control. When the ideological facade finally shatters under the weight of the prosecution's evidence, the true psychological toll of this entire nightmare is going to become painfully visible inside that Florida courtroom, and it is going to happen in a very specific, quiet moment. Picture this scenario. At some point during the grueling proceedings, Joseph is going to sit at that heavy wooden defense table surrounded by his high-priced Florida attorneys, and he is going to naturally look over his shoulder into the gallery. He is going to turn around expecting to see the massive, impenetrable wall of support that his family has always commanded. But when he looks back, he is going to face a brutal, terrifying reality check. The gallery is going to be devastatingly empty. If we look back just a few years to the older brother's highly publicized legal collapse, there were still loyalists. There were still vocal apologists from the quiverful movement showing up to the courthouse, desperately trying to spin the narrative and protect the broader fundamentalist brand. There were family, friends, church elders, and political allies who still believed they could weather the storm. But in 2026, insider reports claim that the isolation surrounding the Duggar family is now absolute and impenetrable. The massive mega churches that used to feature Jim Bob as a keynote speaker have quietly, thoroughly scrubbed the entire family from their websites and digital archives. The massive homeschooling conventions that once paid them exorbitant speaking fees absolutely will not return their calls. The prominent Christian bloggers and influencers who once dedicated entire platforms to defending the Duggar way of life have completely vanished into the shadows, deleting old posts and pretending they never had any association with the Arkansas compound. Exclusive theories circulating among those who track these high control groups suggest that behind closed doors, a massive coordinated excommunication has took place. The broader fundamentalist network has realised that the Duggars are no longer a profitable flagship family. They are a massive radioactive liability. Rumours suggest that Jim Bob has spent the last several months frantically working the phones, calling in favours from old political allies and powerful ministry leaders, practically begging them to make public statements of support or to sit in the courtroom gallery to project strength. But those calls are reportedly going straight to voicemail. The machine that Jim Bob helped build, the very network he poured millions of dollars and decades of influence into, has coldly and efficiently severed ties to save itself. They are sacrificing the Duggars to preserve the survival of their own ministries. For the first time in his entire life, Joseph is going to sit under the terrifying glare of the national media entirely alone, completely abandoned by the community his parents forced him to serve. The psychological devastation of realising that his strict obedience earned him absolutely no loyalty in the end is going to be written all over his face for the jury to see. Which brings us directly to the absolute point of no return. The judge's final gavel in this Florida courtroom is going to signify something so much larger than just Joseph's personal legal fate or his individual freedom. This trial is not a localised incident, it is a historical reckoning. If the prosecution successfully executes this trap, if they manage to use the Duggars' own published rulebook, their own strict accountability structures, and their own suspicious digital timelines to secure a conviction, it permanently and irreversibly changes the historical record. It establishes legally and definitively in a court of law that the Duggar family compound in Tontitown, Arkansas, was never a quirky, wholesome Christian reality television set. It officially brands their home as a systemic incubator for generational harm. Insider reports suggest that federal regulators and legal watchdog groups are watching this specific trial like hawks because a guilty verdict, this creates a terrifying legal precedent for the family's remaining empire. If the court determines that the strict fundamentalist rules were actually used as tools to conceal horrific actions, it opens the floodgates for future civil litigation. Exclusive theories point to the fact that there is no rebranding after a ruling like this. There is no quiet, carefully managed comeback tour in 5 years. There are no more book deals, no more lucrative real estate partnerships in Northwest Arkansas, and no more television specials trying to spin the family's next generation. This trial is the final heavy nail in the coffin of the Duggar empire, and the tragic irony is that they are actively bringing the hammer down on themselves by trying to use a defensive playbook that the prosecution has already decoded. Every single move they make to protect their brand is actively destroying it. Jim Bob's entire legacy, the multi-million-dollar kingdom he built on the absolute promise of parental protection and spiritual superiority, is going to be reduced to a cautionary tale of hubris, control, and devastating hypocrisy. This highly calculated legal strategy is going to backfire in ways nobody is talking about yet, and the fallout for the siblings who are still staying quiet on the sidelines is going to be absolutely massive. The trap is set, the timeline is locked, and the prosecution is just waiting for the defense to make their first fatal move. But what do you think is going to happen next? Will Jim Bob actually risk taking the stand and facing a brutal cross-examination to save his most compliant son, or will he completely abandon Joseph to protect himself from perjury and financial ruin? Drop your wildest theories and predictions in the comments below right now, because I read every single one of them. And if you want to understand the exact financial documents that are about to be leaked, in this case, you need to hit that subscribe button for Daniel Research and turn on the notification bell immediately. In our next video, we are following the money straight into the hidden accounts of the Duggar family trust, uncovering the real estate fire sales nobody is reporting on. And trust me, the numbers absolutely do not lie. I will see you there.